How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Chair Talk. Guys, as promised, today I brought in a retired FBI investigator. A lot of people are going to be familiar with him because if you watch News Nation, I mean, pretty much any national platform, you're going to see this gentleman on. He's just got tremendous knowledge about investigations. He's also just a great representative of the law enforcement profession. And we're going to have him on shortly. I have 11 questions that came my way about the Emmanuel Haro case. And I figure I will be able just to give him those questions. He can give a response. And these questions are coming from you guys, the people that have been supporting the channel recently. So I want to keep on providing you guys with content that you guys agree with. So these are the questions that you want answered. But real quick, just as a summary, you guys, if you're just tuning into the channel, Emmanuel Haro case is about a young boy who at first went missing. The parents said that he was kidnapped, and later the parents are right now being charged with murder. Jake is the father. Rebecca is the mother. There's a lot of inconsistencies with the stories. They both have been arrested. And yesterday I was getting messages because people believed that they thought they had discovered the body of this young boy. People had sent me pictures. Just so you know, real quick, this is the young boy we're talking about. That's Emmanuel Haro. Beautiful boy. And then now I want to show you the adults. So this is parents, Jake Haro and Rebecca Haro. There's a lot of things coming into light now, including the circumstances of Jake Haro's brother's death, Hector. We're still trying to figure out some more information on that. And a lot of people are asking in the chat if Emmanuel Haro was actually Rebecca's son. Again, I don't have information on that just yet. But yesterday when I was getting emails, people had sent me these pictures. And there's a picture of Jake Haro being brought to an area. I have it right here. Let me read this to you guys. Hold on one second. I have it right here. Bear with me. Hold on, guys. I can't see that for a second. My eyesight's not good. So let me bring this up on my phone. So bear with me. I'm going to look at my phone and I'll read what it says. It's right here. All right. So August 24, 2025, this afternoon, a search for Emmanuel Haro was conducted along the westbound shoulder of the 60 freeway near Gilman Spring Roads in Moreno Valley. Investigators were assisted by cadaver dogs. Jake Haro was at the location with detectives. The search has concluded and Emmanuel was not located. That's the heartbreaking part. And the investigation to find Emmanuel continues. And as I said, there's a picture of him being brought to the site, and there's a picture that people took that sent my way. They thought that's when the body was discovered. Now, a lot of people think, did Jake send them on a goose chase, or did animals get to the body? Are they looking for a whole body or looking for a body, sadly, that could have been mutilated? So we have a lot to cover. And as I said, I have a retired investigator from the FBI, Bobby Chacon, coming on. I think you guys will enjoy what he has to offer, but let me bring him on and he can introduce himself, and then we'll go into the questions that you guys have asked. Bobby, what's up, man?
Hi, Anthony. Great to be with you.
Good. I know you are very busy, so thank you for taking the time to
Sure.
come out on the channel. Hey, Bob, you mind introducing yourself real quick?
Sure. My name is Bobby Chacon. I'm a retired FBI agent. I, during the course of my career, mainly specialized in criminal investigations, which did include some child sex crimes. I ran the FBI dive team, where we ended up recovering our share of murdered children that had been placed in the water specifically. And those were all kinds of cases. Some were predator cases, some were infanticide, like the Haro case, being a murder of a child by a parent. We handled all of those kind of crimes during my career.
Hey, Bob, before we get into the questions, how does a job like that affect you? How are you doing?
Well, I get help. I was diagnosed in 2015 with PTSD. I was in New York on 9/11. I was assigned to the New York City office on 9/11, so I was there when the towers were hit. I served 2 tours in Iraq with the FBI. The FBI sent me to Iraq in 2005 and again in 2006. In 2006, I led a team of divers, actually, for the FBI to Iraq, where we were looking for the murder weapon used by 5 U.S. soldiers to rape and kill a 14-year-old Iraqi girl, and who then shot her mother, father, and 5-year-old sister to death, and then set them all on fire. And so I've been involved in a lot of cases like that. But the child cases were always the more difficult ones. the smaller the child, the seemingly more difficult it is. I'm not sure that makes any sense, but it's seemingly, I don't know if it's the smaller somebody is, the less they can protect themselves or defend themselves, or but it's always the child and the animals. You can see I have several rescue dogs here with me. This guy we brought back from Russia, Sasha,
Mm.
and so yeah, so anybody that can put that kind of cruelty to an animal or a child, I think, is almost irredeemable in my eyes. And so when you start dealing with people who could put such cruelty on a child, um, yeah, those are different. So yeah, so I get the help I need still to this day, and I'm not afraid to admit it. It's one of those things when you deal with a lot of kids like that. You know, Unfortunately, I used to come into these cases after the child was probably already deceased, and my job mostly was to find them, and we did find them. And usually we were the first ones to put our hands on the child's body since the
Mhm.
killer. And so we were so oftentimes they'd have a look on their face as if they were looking at their killer in the last moments of their life. And then the next time, the diver was the first one to put their eyes on that child's body or their face. And you could often see the horror in their eyes and frozen on their faces, especially the colder the water. We dove everything from under 4 foot of ice in northern Alaska, where we recovered the dismembered body of a serial killer victim, last known victim of a serial killer, Israel Keys. And then we dove, as I told you, in 2006 in August. It was 130 degrees in southern Iraq, and we were diving in that. So we dove in all kinds of conditions. And so, yeah, so it was, and now I get to talk about it sometimes.
Yeah, well, thank you on so many levels, and for those that are tuning in and will watch the video on the replay, I'm sure they're going to say thank you as well, because obviously
Thanks.
there's sacrifices that you make in order to provide. It's a bittersweet type of
Yes, yeah, very
resolution.
much so. I always used to tell my divers when I was running a team, I said, you have to remember, we're not allowed to celebrate our successes. We're not, at least not openly, because people will misperceive that. You train very hard for a job, and when you do it well and you're successful, you like to have a certain amount of satisfaction. But the way I used to tell them in training, when I was training my new divers, I used to tell them, when we have a good day, it means somebody else is going to have a really bad day. And so you have to keep that in mind. And so it was always kind of, as you said, bittersweet. We could never really fully appreciate or fully be happy with our successes, because our success meant, the worst news somebody else was going to get in their life. And that's a really odd position to be in, when you want to be successful and you want to celebrate your victories and your success, but knowing that your success means what it means, the news it's going to bring to somebody else is kind of a difficult thing to kind of square with. So we would come back from those jobs and we'd feel a certain level of satisfaction, but you could never really truly feel happy about it, if you will. You were successful and you did what you were trained to do under sometimes very dangerous circumstances, and everybody came back okay. You kept the people you could keep safe, and you did your job and you did it well, and it's what we were paid and trained to do. But at the end of the day, it was really hard to be completely happy with our success.
And Bob, there's people on this channel that's never heard that. This will be the first time they heard that. So thank you for sharing that. I think people need
Sure.
to hear that. So a lot of questions at first are going to come in regards to the 2018 incident with Jake Haro and his daughter Promise. So I wanted to focus the first set of questions on that, because that's what came my way. And then the latter half of the questions
Sure.
will be more related to the current. And then if you don't mind, later on, because I know we will discover Emmanuel, I already have something prepped so we can answer some of those questions as well. So
Sure.
the first question I got, and again, thank you for your time, is, let me just move this in first. So this relates to first response to abuse cases. So we're talking about the 2018 incident now. So when investigators encounter a 10-week-old baby with catastrophic injuries, fresh and healing fractures, brain hemorrhages, obvious signs of long-term abuse, what steps are taken immediately to secure evidence and protect other children?
Well, I mean, if the child, obviously, and I know this is obvious, but I have to say it, if the child is still alive, still breathing, if there's a chance that you could save the child's life, all possible life-saving efforts have to be made. And if that means like trampling on evidence or whatever, it doesn't matter. You have to try to save the life of the child, right? So that's you know, and that's always the first, order of business for any first responder and anybody coming up on the scene. So that aside from that, aside from that, the first thing after that is preserving the evidence. And in a as you said, you made a really important description there: healing wounds. So you're going to have wounds or bruises or cuts or whatever damage, injuries you have to the child. If you then also see healing wounds that are also present, and sometimes you can't because they're under the current wounds, you have to get that child, or if they're deceased, that body examined really carefully by someone who's hopefully experienced in the kind of postmortem or autopsy on child victims like that, because it's specific things you're looking for. For example, like I just said, you might have a current bruise over an older bruise, and you have to kind of layer and layer and layer that stuff, because if there is a history of abuse, it becomes very relevant to the case and to maybe a conviction. And so somebody has to really truly document every single injury that child had, and whether it's a fresh injury or if it's a previous injury. If it's a previous injury, how long approximately in the past did that injury occur? And those are all very important details that the investigators will then later on use to kind of build a timeline of the abuse. And then you can kind of match that timeline. If the child, say, was of school age, was there any reports in the school? Or if the child wasn't school age, were there any trips to local clinics, local emergency rooms, things like that, where these injuries were reported? Because you have what we call mandatory reporting. And there are certain people in certain positions, like emergency room doctors or nurses, things like that, who what we call mandatory reports. So if a child comes in with a certain type of injury pattern, they're mandatorily have to report it to either social services, law enforcement. I mean, there's a list of things they have to go through, and it's mandatory. They don't have the discretion of it, because those social services and law enforcement have to get involved, and they can rule it out. Maybe the kid did really, bump into the door, really fall down a small flight of steps, whatever the claim is. Maybe that did happen, but you have to err on the side of caution and get the authorities involved so that you can, see if the injuries are, the result of, of criminal abuse.
Yeah, and obviously those roles that you mentioned, maybe even teachers, because they are the initial contact and maybe even the voice for those children, correct?
That's right. There's a whole list of people that fall under that mandatory reporting requirements. And teachers certainly would be one of them. Yeah.
All right. And again, this falls into the first case with promise. And I have the second question is here. This was a great question that was asked on the comments: is building a case without a voice. From an investigator's perspective, how do you build a case strong enough for attempted murder when a baby can't testify? What kinds of forensics or circumstantial evidence carry the most weight? Because when the people that watch the channel, when obviously they saw what Promise, the results of Promise's injuries, I mean, you got a child now that's 3% active brain, or brain. I'm sorry, she has 3% left of her brain active. She can't walk. She can't see. Obviously a lot of us look at it like, wow, that's definitely, he tried to murder her, but he got charged with willful cruelty, which obviously is a lesser sense than it's a lesser crime than actually attempted murder or murder itself. So basically, how do you help someone who doesn't have that voice, because maybe nobody was advocating for her?
Yeah, that's that's a great question. It's one of the more difficult things involved in this. And so the thing you have to look at is the life of the child. And so, like, none of us live in a vacuum. So are there siblings involved that could shed some light on what was happening in that house? Is there a relative? Is there, a babysitter? Is there a teacher, as you mentioned? Is there somebody that's been in and out of the house or wherever the child was living with the parents, that can shed light on the nature of the relationship? Was this a violent household? Were there former domestic violence complaints. Even again, if he's violent against the wife, he's probably going to be violent against the child. So so you kind of try to recreate the life of that child. What was it like inside that home? And you look at as many different people and things that could shed light on that: neighbors, teachers, workers that are normally in there. If they live in, say they live in an apartment complex, is there somebody that cuts the grass every twice a week or something like that? So you try to get as much information as you can that show you what you'll never get the full picture of what happens inside the four walls of a home, except from the people that were within those four walls. But sometimes you can get a little bit of outside information from a number of different sources, and you have to be really thorough with that. Even delivery drivers, sometimes if they make a lot, we have the same Amazon delivery drivers in the neighborhood all the time. Have they seen something? Postal carriers, did they see something? It's very exhaustive. You've got to, because as the question says, the victim here doesn't have a voice. So you've got to try to build that picture of what was happening in that home from every possible angle you can.
Yeah, and you made a great. I like that pattern what you said. So most likely, if someone abuses the spouse, you could probably safely assume that the child is also being abused.
Yeah, I mean that's a pattern of behavior. An abusive person is going to be, by definition, abusive. That's the way they're. I'm not a doctor, so I can say it, their warped mind deals with conflict, right? If I'm in conflict, if I'm in arguing with somebody and I can't successfully argue my point, then I'm going to resort to violence against that person to convince them of my point. I know it's sick. It's sick. These people have a sickness, and so they resort to violence. And so if that's their mechanism of dealing with stress or dealing with conflict, the fact that it's almost never going to be directed just at one person. That's part of their being. That's part of their personality. It's part of their makeup. So that's the way they're going to deal with conflict. So if they have a conflict with their wife and there's a history of them abusing a wife, then if they can't get their child to stop crying, what do you think is in their toolbox to deal with this stress in their life? And that's what it is.
And if you have two same like-minded people, like in this first case, I think her name was Vanessa, where they both tend to be, I'm assuming, violent after what you look at what happened with Promise, obviously that makes it a more serious concern for the child because there is no escape from the dangers of that environment, correct? When it's two parents that solve things the same way?
Absolutely, of course. I mean, that's what you're talking about is the worst case scenario for a child, right? I mean, that's really horrific, and we've seen that over and over again in cases. I mean, my very first case on the dive team back in 1995 in New York, when I was assigned to the New York office, we had to go out to West Virginia and recover a small child, 5 years old, I think. They just started school, I know that, and it was the case where the mother was abusive, and there were cigarette burns on the child's arm. And when he went to the school nurse, the child said, "Well, mommy puts her cigarettes out on me, but only when I'm bad." So the child was actually thinking, "This is the way you deal with this. The child doesn't see anything wrong with that because this is the only thing they know." So he said, "Mommy puts her cigarettes on me, but only when I'm bad." And for us, what a horrific statement, right? But for that child, that's the only thing they know. And when we went to ultimately look for the child's body, it was actually the father that ultimately carried out the murder, but at the direction of the mother. So you're talking about a child who really didn't even have a chance in life.
And it's crazy how the child is manipulated to take ownership of the mother's abuse.
Because that's all they know.
Yeah, I'm getting burned.
They think every other child is getting the same kind of treatment. They think that's life because that's the only life they know.
So obviously there's a level of isolation there too, because if the parents have to watch out for any type of counter influence, correct?
Absolutely. And that's why you see like the majority of these things happening with kids younger than school age, because once they get into school, then there's an extra layer of secrecy that the parents have to attempt to maintain. Not that you don't see it. Of course, we do see it all the time. But in the case like little Emmanuel, like, that's the kind of case where, there is total isolation. And we've seen the aerial pictures, and I don't live far from where this all took place. In fact, I drove by the pictures you showed earlier of the search area. I drove by there on Saturday. In fact, I didn't know, because you put up the tweet of the sheriff who said on, the 24th, we were out there. Well, I drove by there Saturday night, and there were police and fire there. I thought it was an accident, and when we passed by, there wasn't any accident. And so I said, oh, what is all this police and fire? And it wasn't until the next day I realized, oh, they were out there already securing that scene, because they were going to bring him out on Sunday. This was Saturday night that I drove by, and they were already kind of saying, okay, they must have got some kind of inkling a day earlier, and they wanted to secure it first, and before they brought him out on Sunday during the daylight hours. But this was like darkness. This was about 9 o'clock at night on Saturday night when I drove by, right by the 60 and Gilman Springs Road. It's not far from here, and I saw a bunch of activity there. And so once the child becomes, school age, then it's an extra layer of, of attempts. They have to make sure this is all quiet. And, schools and teachers and school nurses, they've all become more cognizant of what to look for in an abused child. Even if the signs of physical abuse aren't there, many teachers are now very conversant in watching for the signs of, emotional and psychological abuse in children. And that's a good thing. And that's a good step.
Yeah, a lot of people, unfortunately, are following this, felt that because of what happened to Promise, that what happened to Emmanuel should have been prevented. I think you answered what kind of forensics or circumstantial evidence carry the most weight. Did you answer that? Yeah, right?
Well, yeah, I think what you try to do when you try to match your physical, so you have an autopsy or you have medical records that show the pattern of abuse, and then you try to kind of corroborate that with family testimony or family, friends, neighbors, schoolmates, that kind of thing. You always want like a human being on there. You put the doctor up and they read this report, and it's very bland and dry, and it goes through all the injury patterns of, but then it's always best to have a human voice to say, oh yeah, I saw a bruise on him, or he used to tell me, daddy disciplined, or whatever it is, to match you have to have like a human side to match the scientific side. And that's the best kind of evidence to put to a jury.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I said came up. And then we have number 3, I got the investigator-prosecutor divide. So this again is going to relate to the first case. And this is really what's hitting my audience the most, because this is where they feel something more should have been done. So the investigator-prosecutor divide, the 2018 outcome. So in Promise's case, Jake Haro ended up with just 180 days. As an investigator, how frustrating is it when the evidence shows prolonged torture, but the charges are plea deal, and it just doesn't reflect that? And where does the breakdown usually happen between law enforcement and prosecution?
Yeah, and I think the thing is, so when the police make an arrest and they bring a person to jail, they lodge them in, and they have to basically write down like what the charges are. Well, that's not official, because the person hasn't gone before a judge yet, and that's where the charges are actually filed by the prosecutor's office. But they have to log them in a lot of times under suspicion of child abuse or suspicion of murder, whatever it is, and because those aren't official charges. So it's always interesting to get that initial law ledger and see what the police booked him. When you say they book him, what the police booked him in, and then ultimately what he was charged with, that's second step, and then what they pled guilty to is actually the third step. And all of those steps usually go down. So usually the highest charge is what they book them on, because the cops just want to, they want to make sure that because it's hard to go back up once you go low. So they want to charge them with the highest charge. So from the booking charge, what the police think they're going to be charged with, to what the prosecutor actually files at that initial appearance in court, and then to what they've actually ultimately plead guilty to if there's a deal, it's kind of successive steps down, unfortunately. And that is a huge problem. Now, normally, I will say this, I've worked with prosecutors that do child sex crimes, and they are very dedicated to putting away really bad people for the longest possible time. They aren't always able to do that for a number of different reasons. The court systems are terrible at handling these kind of cases. Judges just don't do the right thing when it comes to sentencing, for whatever reason. And I don't want to ever hear a judge say, oh, jails are overcrowded. That's too bad. these are some of the worst types of criminals we have, and we owe it to our most vulnerable populations to do everything we can to people that are habitually harming them to be put away and to be taken out of that situation where they can do more harm, no matter how long it takes. And so there is sometimes a divide, but if you're dealing with a prosecutor that handles these cases over and over again, they're usually pretty invested in it. Their heart is on the line because sometimes they deal with it even more than a cop who kind of arrests somebody on one of these things, unless they're assigned to like a special victims unit or things like that, where they're handling that only every day. But even in those kind of units, they generally work with a team of prosecutors who also do those kind of cases. It's when you get out into more rural jurisdictions where they don't have a lot of those cases, so they don't have a dedicated special victims team in the law enforcement or on the prosecution side, that you do sometimes have plea bargains that are offered that we just shake our heads at, because we don't have any control. The law enforcement doesn't have any control over what the prosecutor's office is going to plead them to, and there's a number of reasons why they take those pleas. We don't agree with it. We think law enforcement always thinks it has enough evidence, and the prosecutors always want more evidence, and they're always afraid of losing at trial. And I understand that that's a completely valid concern, but in these types of cases, I think the system there needs to be a real revampment of the system, how we handle these people. I don't think they should ever get bail in these cases. And then if they're convicted, I think the penalties should be, much, much stricter. We're just seeing too many of these repeat offenders. And they're going to repeat offend, unless they're given a very lengthy prison sentence and then given the opportunity somehow to, get whatever, and I don't want to sound like I'm sympathetic to them at all, but get them some kind of deep psychological help that they may need to deal with whatever it is that's causing them this. And I say that, like, while they're incarcerated for a lengthy period of time, they should get that help. They shouldn't get it, out on the street to reoffend again.
Yeah, and one of the things that the audience was really frustrated with is that they were looking at the work details. So supposedly he served one day and then he was on work release. So we looked at the criteria for work release, and the criteria was, well, you can't be a violent crime. And then the audience was very upset when they found out that child cruelty wasn't listed as a violent crime. I would like to have your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, at least here in California, they changed the definitions of a lot of violent crimes. Because of prison overcrowding, they always fudge with the numbers on crimes. I've seen it for 30 years. And so, the threshold for what is a violent crime and what it isn't is not what you would think. It's not any kind of rational line being drawn. It's a convenient line for them to say, okay, we can push these people out of prison now so we can lower our prison numbers. And that's really what it boils down to. And unfortunately, a lot of times when they plead to those lesser charges, obviously they get sentenced to lesser time, and it doesn't create the record that you need to record. So if you arrest him later on, his criminal history doesn't look as bad as it should look based on his behavior. So his prior criminal history is always going to reflect a suppressed view of the level of behavior that person exhibited. So in other words, you never get charged with a higher crime than you actually committed, but oftentimes you ultimately get charged or convicted or plead to a lower crime than you were originally caught for. And so, when you look at someone's criminal history, you want to be able to rely on that and say who this person was in the past. But oftentimes you have to inflate it or exaggerate it, because whatever they pled to or whatever they were convicted to, or they were even charged with, was probably lower than the actual behavior that they committed to get arrested. And so that's a real problem, because we're not getting an accurate picture of these people, and then they're not being sentenced properly.
And out of curiosity, when you look at promises injuries, and obviously later when you find out, the consequences of those injuries, is it hard to maybe take this to trial and push intent as attempted murder? Is that hard to prove?
Yeah, I mean, attempted murder, obviously, unfortunately, you have to have, intent. Attempted murder, it depends there are levels of murder and attempted murder in the books. And so there are differing levels of those types of crimes. And so I'm not a prosecutor in California. I am an attorney, but I'm not a prosecutor in California. So I'm less knowledgeable, I would say, about how and what you can charge people with. But I know that there's an intent. So if you can try, how are you going to prove, even if somebody comes in there and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, the baby was crying and I hit the baby. I didn't mean to hurt it. Didn't mean to kill it." So that's a tough one to you might have. And remember, the defense only needs one person or jury to hold out. So it's one of those things, like you said earlier, that there's no voice for the victim here, oftentimes. And the younger the child, the less chance that they're going to have playmates or going to have other people who've witnessed this type of stuff. And so, for an infant, certainly somebody in the infant stage of their life is not going to have a voice, and is not going to have probably many people around that witness this stuff. And then, the person could always fall back on, "I didn't mean to do it," and which is, obviously BS in most cases. But as a prosecutor, you have to always look at, how am I going to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 people at the same time? And so sometimes they go with a lesser crime that they know they're going to get a plea to, if I can get the guy to plead to that at least. And I think in the back of their mind, sometimes it's like, okay, if I get a plea to him, at least it's going to be on his record. And then, if he does it again, then we'll have this to go back to and enhance it. But I'm like, if it happens again, now you're almost giving in to the fact that there's going to be another victim out there, which is a horrible thing to think about. I mean, look at this case. I mean, I think you're right. I think had that first case been handled properly, little Emmanuel might still be alive. I mean, I don't even, maybe he wouldn't exist, because, the father wouldn't be out there to have another child.
And the funny thing is, one of the things that the people are commenting on is, they believe, like in the first case with Promise, she didn't really have much of a voice. So there was really no pressure. So like maybe sometimes the prosecutor also looks at the political pressure, the outside pressure. Like, maybe I can't go for a plea on this because the public is going to want to see something happen to, like, the Emmanuel case. I mean, the funny thing is, maybe there could be pressure that pushes the prosecutor to say, "Hey, I'm not going to put a plea out there, because if I do, the pressure I'm going to get from the outside." But maybe Promise, didn't have that support, that pressure, so they
That's
felt
right.
more enabled to make a plea.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That is, that's a very, very real thing in our current landscape with the internet and with true crime and things like that. Yes, publicity puts pressure on politicians, and every mayor and every sheriff and every elected official at, like, certainly at the county level, city and county level, they're much more sensitive to crime data. That's why we always see the crime numbers reported low, because every mayor in the country runs on crime. There's very little they can do about the economy. That's a much more of a national issue. But on the local issue, crime is the number one issue that a lot of mayors run on, and city and county governments and sheriffs and stuff like that. So, if you get a case that has, like, all this publicity, well, the politicians, the DA, feels the pressure. A mayor certainly would feel the pressure, and then they won't let you, get that plea. They'll make you take it to trial, and they'll make you charge it, properly and stuff. Unfortunately, most cases don't get that examination. I have a series running on Hulu right now called "The Murder Has Two Faces," and it has, each episode we do is we put two cases that are very similar to each other, one of which got worldwide publicity, and one which was in the same area, same type of crime, got almost no publicity. And why is that? Why do some cases get publicity and some don't? Like, for example, the first episode, Lacey Peterson. So I took my dive team up to Richmond Bay, and we searched the bay for Lacey and Connor. 3 months before Lacey disappeared, Evelyn Hernandez disappeared in San Francisco, 8 months pregnant, found in the water. The case was never solved, and nobody ever paid any attention to it. And it was almost similar to the Lacey Peterson case, same geographic area. She was a woman almost the same age, almost the same length of pregnancy and stuff. And, Lacey Peterson got global, worldwide publicity, and Evelyn Hernandez got almost no mention. And so my paradigm in that show, you'll hear me say, pressure, press equals pressure. Pressure equals, how do I say it? So press, the more press something gets, the more pressure is going to be on. Pressure equals resources. So if my bosses see it all over the newspaper, and they're getting calls from Washington or whatever, when I was with the FBI, then they would make sure that I had everything I need to do the case. And then resources equal results for the most part, not every case, but so press equals pressure, pressure equals resources, resources equal results. And it's the cases, like you said, that catch fire, that go viral, that get the publicity. That publicity brings pressure. That pressure brings resources, and those resources bring results generally.
Sorry, my mic. Sorry about that. Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. Like you said, I also think like sometimes the media will also create a narrative that the people can relate to. So like a single mother, or in Kohlberger's case, 4 college students, they push something that should be seen as a safe role. And then how that role has now been violated. And it's funny, just on a side note, us in corrections have to manage that perception because people on the outside, they kind of deal with the crime. We have to deal with the man or the woman who committed the crime, which tends to be yes, what they did was horrible. I'm not minimizing that, but they're not the monster. They can be controlled, and it's interesting. For the next question I got, and thank you. Your information is just phenomenal. So I appreciate. I know there's
thank you.
A couple of questions here left, but just man, the amount of information you put in, my audience is going to love it. I just think you're just amazing.
Thanks.
It's true. I wanted to add this about tracking known abusers. So Jake Haro served his short sentence, got out, had more children. From an investigative standpoint, do systems exist to track down child abusers, or is law enforcement essentially blind once probation ends?
I mean, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't know the specific answer here in California. I know like we do have, everybody knows about the sex offender registries. You can actually put in your zip code, I think, and then you can find in your geographic area all the known sex offenders that are on the registry that have kept up with their requirements to register. We've also had cases where, people register, but they're not living at the address they've registered to. They're living somewhere else. They kind of play. I mean, as well as I do, the criminal element in our population is the most adaptable, inventive population. Once the system changes, they change almost immediately. They know how to navigate the systems for their benefit. And so I don't know, but I certainly think that if there isn't, there certainly should be, just like a sex registry, there should be a domestic violence registry, and there should be a child abuse registry. And oftentimes somebody's going to fall on 2 or 3 of those different registries. And I think we need to, because we don't involuntarily institutionalize people like we used to, throw them into, what they call a mental institution, mental hospital. Because we don't really do that anymore. What way are we tracking this abhorrent behavior that people habitually engage in? And this is, rapists are the kind of crime that you see happen over and over again by the same offender. These are people who are going to reoffend in the same manner over and over again. And there needs to be a way to track these people, because, like I said, if you can do this to a child, you're going to do it again if you're put in that situation. And so we need to kind of track these people post-incarceration, if they're incarcerated, post-incarceration, much, much more carefully and much more closely than we are. And we need to put much more strict post-incarceration conditions on their release back out into the world. Maybe lifetime probation. And that probation includes, twice weekly visits to a therapist, or check in with your parole officer. And certainly, you're not to have any contact with children for a certain number of years once you're released. Things like that. I think we need to do a much better job at dealing with these people, not only pre-incarceration, because a lot of times, people get incarcerated, then they'll let go. Maybe they have probation, maybe they don't. If they don't, then they're out to reoffend again if they want. And even if they are on probation, sometimes they can, be good for as long as the term of probation, and they get off, and then they can reoffend, or they just violate their probation and it's not taken seriously. For example, in the Haro case, Jake Haro was on probation for the Promise case, and he violated that probation for carrying a gun. I think carrying a weapon was carrying a firearm was part of his, but he wasn't allowed to do that as part of his probation once he got out, and he violated it. And he had a hearing coming up. That's why he had a lawyer, by the way. A lot of people So he had a lawyer that was going to represent him in this probation violation, and he was let out. Once you violate, or at least you're accused of a violation, you should be thrown back in pending the resolution of that alleged violation. And so why was he still out when he was already convicted, already released, and then on these conditions, and then he violates those conditions and he's still out? And it becomes double and triple frustrating when you hear these type of things, that he was out under certain conditions, he violated those conditions, and they said, oh, well, come back, we'll have a hearing about your violation. No, he should actually be incarcerated until the violation gets either dismissed or gets deemed valid, and then he should be reincarcerated because he violated the conditions of his release. And it didn't happen in this case.
Yeah, my friend Joe, when I had him on the show recently, and it actually resonated with the audience, was basically he said something to the extent of, we do more for people that violate the rights of animals than we do actually for those that violate the rights of children. And the audience resonated with that because they agree. And then the other thing that we were talking about too is the fact that with these abusers, for us in corrections, I mean, I work with a lot of people that make their effort to rehabilitate. And yes, I've worked at sex treatment centers as well. They'll tell you, for some people, you're going to try your best to manage the compulsion, but you're not going to be able to cure them, which means that, you'll manage impulsive behavior because that's the goal. But at any point, they can go back to what they're most comfortable with. So it's not like they go free to the world and you could say, hey, I'll trust them with my children now. That's how good I did of a service. No, they're just trying to minimize, but they'll openly tell you we cannot cure them, especially even like they said with sex offenders, because the impulse is too great that they have to have the willpower to control that compulsion. I think the same thing is with people that act in violence. If that's their way of immediately solving something, eventually when something becomes a concern that they can't solve, they're going to go back to what they know, they believe works. And that's going to be the impulsion to finish that pattern, just keep on doing that pattern.
Absolutely.
And that actually gets to the next question. And that was a great lead in. Pattern of offending. So in your experience, when someone abuses an infant to this level, so we're looking at Promise now, but maybe even Emmanuel Haro, what does it indicate about their likelihood to reoffend? Kind of touched on that, but should investigators and child protection agencies treat them as a permanent risk? Now, what's funny, Bobby? The other day when we had a show, I said a lot of people are worried about rights. And I get it. I mean, we all have rights, but sometimes it's not that we take away someone's rights they did when they committed to an action that makes them a risk. So it's like, well, you can't take away someone's rights from parenting. I didn't take it away. They did. Now, my job is to make sure that they don't hurt somebody else. Because at one point, what about their rights now affecting the rights of somebody else? When do we start making a choice that, I'm sorry, but if this person has the chance to reoffend, I'm going to be more worried about someone that they could bring into the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. And really, it comes down to the way our whole system is built, right? Our system is one of deterrence. So our system doesn't prevent somebody from murdering somebody else, right? But what our system does is, if you murder someone, here's the penalty. And so the penalty is supposed to be a deterrent. I am not going to do that because if I do, I know what's going to happen to me. And so that's the deterrent effect, right? But the key word you used in the last question was compulsion. When somebody has a compulsion, a physical, mental compulsion to commit certain activities, behavior, which are criminal, they can't. The deterrent effect doesn't always work because, like you said, sometimes they can be put on medication that helps them control the compulsion. Oftentimes, they stop taking the medication, or the medication doesn't work, or it's like a moving target. They need more medication or less medication, and then we don't follow the aftercare. We don't give them. We don't keep them under strict scrutiny once their incarceration and their conditions of release are finished. And so our system is not, and there's a good argument, I guess, that it shouldn't. We can't penalize for people for something they may do in the future. However, as you point out, there are certain indicators that put somebody in a much higher category, much more likely to do something in the future than the rest of us. And how do we deal with that? How as a system, as a society, how do we deal with these people? Most of us in this category, and then you have certain people in the category that says, based on, and doctors will tell you, psychologists, psychiatrists, well, if they've had this pattern of behavior previously, they are in a much higher likely category to redo that behavior than the rest of us. And how do we deal with that? Well, again, our system is not really set up to punish people or to deal with people that might do something in the future, based on what they've done in the past. And even, I mean, we've all been frustrated with trials where we've seen like juries sit on a criminal trial and they don't get to hear about the person's prior behavior in some cases because that's deemed irrelevant to the current case. And it isn't. Some of us see it as not irrelevant to the current case, and the jury should know who they were in the past because it relates to who they are now in this current alleged crime. And so that's a frustrating thing, in that we try to kind of compartmentalize the crime and what happened here, and what happened in the past is the past and it's not relevant. But sometimes it is relevant. Oftentimes, probably much more often, it is relevant than not relevant. And so it's a very frustrating part, but our system is just not set up that way. But it should be, especially in certain crimes, especially in serial rapists, serial child abusers, things like that, where this is compulsive activity that is not going to stop unless there are serious restrictions on the person's ability to behave like that.
Yeah, and you made a great point. If I could just piggyback on something you said. So something I do in corrections is, obviously we want people to lead with integrity. And we tell people that integrity is really inspired or internally driven. It's not motivated in conditions of doing the right thing or you'll go to jail, or do the right thing, you'll lose your family, or do the right thing, you'll lose your job. So my biggest thing is, when you have deterrence as the main motivator, then what happens is, before I go to hit a child, I may think, well, maybe there's a way I can hide it where I won't get discovered. So now the external condition of getting caught no longer becomes the deterrent. So at that point here, same thing I think with the Jake Haro case would be, you know what? I'll beat the kid and then I'll hide the kid. So therefore it doesn't get discovered. So the deterrent, I like what you said, the deterrent does not add a lot of weight. It actually makes the right thing conditional.
Right. Absolutely conditional. Sure. Yeah. There's nothing in our laws that prevents people from murdering each other, except that I'm going to go to jail for life with no parole if I murder somebody, like that kind of thing. But it's that's not a prevention. Yeah. It prevents people who, like you and me, have or don't want to go to jail. We don't want that to happen to us. We're not compulsively driven. And so we can make that rational assessment of, if I kill this person, I'll go to jail for the rest of my life. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to kill that person. It almost comes down to that being that simple. But like you said, and I think the key to this whole thing is that one word you used was compulsion. And that's what that does. Compulsion overcomes rationality. Compulsion overcomes all rational thought. And when they act on those compulsions is when you see that kind of behavior.
Yeah, and I think the way the world's working now is people think that punitive or punishment is strictly no. Punishment aligns with safety. Punishment aligns with accountability. Especially in the law enforcement realm. And yeah, sure, the person that did the crime will look at it as being punishment because they don't want the accountability, and they could give two shits about other people's safety. But we in law enforcement, our punishment is basically we're doing it for safety and accountability, and sometimes that gets minimized.
Right.
I got a couple more questions, and I appreciate you again. We're starting to move forward. I think this is the last question related to the promise, the 2018 incident, but I have misread flags. So looking back at the Haro case, or the 2018 case, what investigative or interagency red flags stand out to you? Things that should have triggered more monitoring, tighter supervision, or even harsher charges in 2018? Because he was charged in 2023, I believe, or he went through the sentence in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, again, it looks to me like he was probably booked on a higher charge and pled to a much, much lesser charge. And then the legislature has to go back and change those laws back to the way they were. When they went through 10 years ago or more, when California went through that whole prison overcrowding situation where, they were pushing people out the door, they started making people, charged with lesser crimes, or they started drawing the line in a different place on what's considered violent crimes. I think that, and all the effort has always been to do that, to incarcerate less people. But when you're talking about a child abuser, and by the way, so we're looking at Promise as if it's his first instance of child abuse. It's the first instance he was caught. We don't know necessarily that it's his first incidence of child abuse. And that's oftentimes with criminals, right? Their first arrest is almost never their first offense. They just weren't caught before. And so with compulsive crimes like this, with a serial child abuser, Promise may not have been the first, or he may have abused her previously. He may have abused children previously to that. We just know that was the first time he was caught. And so that's why we can't treat these people very lenient, because, and again, we can't penalize them for things we don't know about or things that, they weren't caught for. But certain types of crimes can be treated more strict because of the very nature of the crime, like child abuse. And we treat it just like any other crime. We treat it like, okay, you take a deal, we're going to give you a lesser sentence. Well, maybe, there's this whole, no bail type of thing where anybody get arrested for anything can be just let go until their trial because they're innocent until proven guilty. Well, with a child abuse case, now you're putting more people at risk, more children at risk, that same child at risk, if they've survived the initial abuse. So I think there are certain categories of crimes where there should be no bail, there should be no parole, there should be no good time. If you get sentenced to 8 years, you do 8 years, whatever it is, and then you follow that with very, very strict release conditions. I wouldn't have any problem with reclassifying certain crimes like child abuse, under those kind of conditions. But we don't. We allow plea bargains. We allow, probation with very minimal conditions and things like that. And I think that that's what needs to change.
Yeah, and it's funny is even in corrections, small things matter to us because we know small things can escalate, and sometimes people can always find a way to provide excuses, minimize or whatever what they've done. But technically, when we always go back to look at, let's say, years later, something does happen, we always look back to that one smaller incident, wondering what did we miss, what could we have done a little bit more, and it's easier said looking back than it is in the moment, because of so many different ways that issue could be looked at. The context that was presented to somebody in the moment.
Right.
So I have that. Now, this is last questions are going to go towards the current. This is definitely more of a tactical question that you definitely fall within your area of expertise here. But I wanted to talk about the current search efforts because this came my way. These questions came my way as well. So it says the investigators recently searched again for Emmanuel. So now we're talking about Emmanuel Haro now. So this is going to be the incident 2025, but came up empty. Even bringing Jake Haro out to the scene. So that just happened the other day. What's the investigator strategy behind involving a suspect directly in a search, and what are investigators hoping to learn when they already suspect the worst?
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that are split on this, right? It's like, you can charge somebody, by the way, it's not desired, but you can charge somebody with murder without having the body. But prosecutors, always obviously would prefer to have the child body returned and stuff. So you sometimes are not totally at the behest of the criminal, but you have to kind of offer something in return for, telling us where the body is. And so that's distasteful to some people. And some people say, no deal. You tell us where she is or where he is, and we're going to try you to maximum charge. Well, then they won't tell you, So there is sometimes, I hate to use it bargaining, but there is some bargaining and some negotiation about, now in this case, who knows? Now maybe, and because yesterday they brought him out there and they didn't find him, maybe he only heard where Emmanuel might be. Maybe the mom is the one that put him somewhere, and she told him approximately where, so he was guessing. It's hard for me to think why he would be out there and not lead them right to the body if he was the one that put the child there. Now, of course, the child could have been moved, like you said earlier. Could have, an animal I live nearby, and there's all kinds of wildlife here. There's coyotes. There's all kinds of things. here, bobcats and stuff. And so, yeah, it's hard for me to think that he would not have led them out there to the body if, in fact, that was his intent. And so it really baffled me. I thought for sure if he was out there with them that they would find little Emmanuel. I don't know the answer to why they didn't yet. We hopefully will know that eventually. But what you're trying to do is, you can charge it, and obviously they have charged it without the body. But hopefully they'll, they have some. I'm sure the investigators behind the scenes are working on, where the child possibly could be.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think we lean towards Jake because when this happened, I think everybody ran with Jake at first. So we know a lot more about Jake than we do about Rebecca. And Jake happens to have the red flag that the media focused on. And maybe, that could be just a red herring. We don't know. But right now, we do have more reason to believe it could be him because we know more about him.
I worked a case in Cleveland, Ohio years ago. I was called out with the dive team to find a child that was put in the river. And the mother put the child in the river, but it was the mom's new boyfriend, not the child's father, but the mom's new boyfriend who had beaten the kid the night before, to literally within an inch of his life. Mom knew the child was going to be dying. And instead of bringing him to an emergency room where he would have received the care he needed, but would also have resulted in new boyfriend going to jail again, and then violating a strict parole condition, going to jail for a long time. Again, like you said, get rid of it, no problem, right? And so to make the problem go away, even though the boyfriend had beat the child, and this is not this case, this is another case I worked years ago, even though the boyfriend had beat the child, the mom is the one that carried the child down to the river because she didn't want the boyfriend going back to jail for a long time. So they were involved both. So I don't know what the relationship or the involvement between Jake and Rebecca were with little Emmanuel. Hopefully we will find out that in time.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was younger, I was a kid. I had a friend of mine I grew up with. We were about 2 years apart. So he was about a sophomore when I was about a senior. And his father had died years ago. His mother died. And eventually his older sister and her boyfriend were the ones taking care of him. And then we later found out they were doing these robberies. None of us knew that they were doing the robberies. I mean, Stephen, I don't want to put his name out there, but he was a great kid, a great friend. But what wound up happening is one of the robberies went bad. The owner fought back, and Steve got shot. Oh, I keep on saying his name. He got shot. Yeah, it is what it is. It's in the papers from years ago, but he got shot. It was an injury that I think a lot of us think that if he would have went to the hospital, he could have been helped. But either way, they get him in the car, and the boyfriend, I think, convinced his sister, who they had a very tight relationship, the sister and the brother, to kind of drop him off by the river. And I think what he did was he kind of pushed the leverage of being caught. Now we're both going to be responsible. And it basically just eliminated, I mean, even love, you think love could be a primary force to do the right thing, but people go into survival mode. I mean, this brother and sister were the closest they could be, but the moment this person pushed the leverage of we're both going to go down, we're both going to do life, whatever it is, when we could do it this way, and they made the bad choice. They both went to jail. She's out, and I think he's got a longer sentence. I don't know if he's still in the system. I haven't really.
And the brother died?
Yeah, the brother died. Yeah, he died. They found him by the river. And that ultimately, I think now, outside of what they've done, now they have some level of negligence in regards to he could have been helped, and you chose not to help him.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's also going to happen in cases like this too, where you may have acted impulsively. Okay, fine. Maybe even though we wouldn't agree with it, it's human. What'd you do after that? You covered it up. That's the problem.
Right.
That's
because he's telling her, I'm already on one alleged violation of my parole. If now I get caught beating little Emmanuel, they're going to lock me up and throw away the key. And, that may have prevailed upon her to assist him in this. Obviously, she assisted, because that story about the Big Five parking lot is a bunch of BS, right? We know that. There's no way. I've been hit. I've been punched in the face a bunch of times. My nose has been broken about 5 times. I've been hit in the head with a metal pipe, and I lost consciousness. To lose, it cut open my head. To lose consciousness, and her story about getting hit and blacking out, for a human being to lose consciousness like that from one hit in the head, it has to be such a hard blow it would either open up the head because the skin on most of your head is very thin, and the bone is just beneath, and there would be blood, there would be a laceration at the least. To cause a blackout, to cause you to lose consciousness, it would have to be such a blunt force trauma that you would have to see an emergency room doctor. They would probably order a CAT scan. They wouldn't, not probably, they would. Whenever there's a loss of consciousness from a head injury, there's a CAT scan, and there's most likely a concussion. There's not just a tiny little black eye. So her story from the very beginning, that she lost consciousness from below her head, she just didn't have the mechanism of injury present to actually think or believe that she lost consciousness from a single blow to the head. Because a single blow to the head can cause you to lose consciousness, but it would also leave a much bigger injury pattern than she had.
Which is a great, because everybody assumed it was the aged black eye, but you're right. You said you got hit in the back. You know, I don't see any bruises in the back. So the next question I got, we got 3 more left, and this is, and thank you for doing this again. I know it's a lot. You're very busy.
No worries.
And I truly appreciate this. And hopefully we're going to have you on again. I have more cases, but I just want to follow through the one first. So I got murdered. We talked about, actually, you kind of jumped on this already. So it's actually maybe, I don't know if there's really much more to discuss, but I said murder charge without a body. So despite no body being recovered, both parents are now charged with murder. You know, from your experience, what kind of evidence enables prosecutors to move forward with the murder case under these conditions, and how high does the bar have to be? It was funny. I looked up death penalty sentences without a body, and every place I looked, they really couldn't find any where the death sentence was carried out or put on the table without a body being found. And again, I don't know how accurate that was. I looked it up at a few. I went through Google, ChatGPT, Claude, but they kind of said that there wasn't really much information on that. So I'm wondering here, and I guess the question's coming here, is when you don't have a body, how do you move forward with a murder case? Like, so I don't have the manual in front of me, but how do I charge them with murder?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be the death penalty, but there's a lot of people who get convicted of murder with no body, and they get sentenced to life in prison, or life, 25 to life, or something like that. It's actually easier the younger the victim, and that's because we've seen these things. I mean, look, we've seen the Chris Watts case in Colorado, a lot of these cases where even though the friends say that mom would never leave her 2 babies, or that whatever, she would never just up and leave, but the husband's claim, who's usually the killer, the husband's claim is always, she had a boyfriend, she ran away with the boyfriend. So the older a person gets, or the teenager that disappears, who's run away 5 times, and now she's been abducted and killed. But there are people that want to say, oh, she's run away 5 times, this is just time number 6. That's none of those things are present with a 7-month-old baby. And they didn't just run away, they didn't just take off. And there's the biological parents right there, who have obviously custody of the child. Where else would the child be? Other than with the biological parents at 7 months old. None of those other things that we've seen in other cases can be alleged. You can't allege this baby ran away. You can't allege, I mean, all they could do was cook up some fake scheme about, frankly, I've talked to friends who work human trafficking. A 7-month-old special needs child is not going to be a very attractive human trafficking target. And so that story is preposterous. And so the younger the child is, the easier it is to put in front of a jury that says, this is what they claim. They claim that the child was taken by some unknown people that they didn't even see, some ghosts, if you will. But they're the biological parents. That's where this child was living. And now they have no explanation for his seemingly disappearance. And like I said, hopefully by the time this goes to trial, they'll have little Emmanuel's body back. But that's why it's a little easier for a prosecutor to get up and tell this story to a jury, that there is no other explanation other than these parents murdered this child. Because people just don't disappear, right? We just don't go poof or disappear. There are cases where, a 17-year-old kid, runs away, or, a 25-year-old mom, finds a boyfriend and goes away. That's at least plausible. Sometimes not believable, but plausible. It's not in this case. When you have a 7-month-old child, you have the biological parents lying about his disappearance. So I think that in this kind of case, it's much, I'm not saying easier, but it's much more believable that you could move forward with this kind of case without a body, because what else is there? Like, what other possibility could it be? There is no, you think about it, there is no other possibility. This is not a runaway. This is not somebody who's having an affair and disappears with, there's not somebody who ran away into the Caribbean or changed their, went off the grid and changed their ID. This is a 7-month-old child living with his biological parents, and now the child is gone. I mean, I don't know. I think that makes it more plausible to put in front of a jury and for a jury to believe that those parents had something to do with this child's disappearance.
I know before when we said bargaining, I kind of, I use leverage, because obviously people are going to want closure. And sometimes the people that are being accused of this, they know they got the leverage, because it's not even about the case. Like, okay, I'll give you the body, but I don't want the murder charge. Now, granted, let's say that is on the table, hypothetically. Let's say, Jake could be in a position to bargain right now. Maybe that's why we saw him out there willingly, because maybe something is being mentioned to him where they realize, hey, listen, we got to find this body. That's the key right now. So we'll work within these parameters. Could they take a murder charge off? What would be the lesser sentence there? What would be the lesser charge?
Yeah, they could. Yeah, they certainly could do that. And what they're going to do, and hopefully, and this is the way it's normally done, is now you have two people. They're not both equally culpable in this crime, in my opinion. One of them was probably more responsible than the other. And I'm not saying which one. I don't know. Obviously, normally you would think it was Jake. I'm not so sure. I don't know. I'm not saying either way. I'm just saying that the investigators and the prosecutors, based on what they found in that house, based on all the interviews, and based on the interviews with these two themselves, they probably have a fairly good idea of which of these two was more responsible, more culpable. And hopefully, you always try to make the deal with the person less culpable, the person who only helped, get rid of the body, whatever it is in this situation.
Is that because you got more? Is that because you got more room to kind of maneuver with them?
No, yeah, a little bit. But I mean, it's usual, because you always want to hold the person most responsible for the crime to the highest standard, and to have them punished the harshest, because they were the ones that were most responsible, whichever one that is in this case. And so you look at the other one and you say, do you really want to take the fall? All you did was, and that's a little game you play, but like you use those kind of words to kind of get them to come to your side. So look, all you did was help bury the body, whatever it is. Do you really want to go to jail for the same thing as if you had murdered the child? Do you want to do that? Isn't that unfair? You shouldn't have to do that. And so, like, you always go after, you target the one you think your investigation has revealed is less culpable, less responsible. It's horrific what they did and stuff, but if you're trying to get the cooperation, you always go after the one less culpable, because you never want somebody like in the second position to be punished higher than the person in the first position as far as responsibility goes and stuff. And so you always aim at the other person who you think had less responsibility or less guilt in the whole overall scheme, and then you get them to testify against the other one, and you always try to hold the person most responsible to the highest penalty. And so that's whoever that is. Normally, obviously we always think the wife is the least culpable. We don't know that in this case yet. But I think that they kind of have an idea of it. The police and the prosecutors, they probably have an idea of which one they think, and they may not be right either, but they've done the searches at the house. They've done the searches on the phones and the computers. They've talked to each of them. They've talked to other witnesses. So they have the most information to make that kind of, accounting on, we think this one is less responsible than that one. So let's go talk to this one and see if they'll take a deal.
Do you know, I don't, maybe I don't, do you know who has the final say if an authorized some type of agreement? Do you know?
Yeah, the Riverside County. In this case, it'll be the Riverside County DA, I believe.
Okay.
I believe. Well, it could be San Bernardino, because it's right by the. It's right by the borderline between Riverside County and San Bernardino County. So it's so it would be the DA of the county where the crime took place and it's charged. So that would be the ultimate person who would be the stamp of approval for a deal. If it would be the ultimate authority, would be the district attorney in the county in which the crime was charged.
All right, I have two last questions. Okay, again, this is investigating the Haro home. So beyond the search areas, what happens at the Haro's residence itself? In a situation like this, how do investigators comb through a home looking for trace evidence, inconsistencies, or signs of what may have happened to a manual?
Yeah, so unfortunately, in a case like this, they had time to clean up, but oftentimes they can't clean up as good as our crime scene teams can get in there and look with luminol, with sprays, with dark lights and stuff. You can actually see where they've tried to clean up stuff. So if there's an excessive amount of blood somewhere in the house, like for a child, because childs are messy, and their urine and waste is going to be sometimes dropped in different places in the house. That's not unusual, like to have the DNA of the kid all over the house. However, large amounts of blood are going to be unusual. And so, hopefully they've used, obviously this is aside from taking all their, physical stuff, the computers and the phones and all that kind of stuff. Then you look at the physical evidence of real forensics of it, and you look and you start doing, search patterns for blood on carpets, walls, ceilings, even anything in the house, anything outside the house. Anything in the trash that they may have thrown away. Hopefully, if you got that. So yeah, they're doing close examinations on, unfortunately in this case, probably blood, and to see if there are any kind of large amounts of blood or places where blood was, and now they get an indication that there was previously blood here, and there are different tests and different chemicals that they can use to determine that.
Yeah, I even see how they were searching. They go from the inside to the outside, so it's like they search maybe where the incident occurred and then what they try to do to dispose of the body. That's what I'm thinking, because I see a lot of the stuff was inside the house, and they went by the dumpsters, and now they're out in this one area that you just mentioned, off of, I'm not familiar with there, Route 60 or Gilman?
60, yeah, Highway 60 and Gilman Spring Road. Yeah, for example, like if you do a search inside the house, and on an end table, and this is just a generic case, there's a dust pattern of a nice square on the end table where there used to be, like, looks like a lamp was sitting there. Now the lamp's not there. Well, now you're going to go outside and you look in the trash or in the dumpster for a lamp with a square base to it, because they probably got rid of the lamp, but they left behind a little dust pattern of what used to be here. Now, why did they get rid of it? Maybe they used that as a blunt instrument. So you do kind of tie what you find inside to lead you outside the house.
That's cool. And then the last question, I thought was just more subjective, but I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So talking about Jake Haro's history of severe child abuse in 2018, how do investigators ensure they remain objective in the current case involving Emmanuel? In other words, how do you balance the need to recognize clear patterns of behavior while still treating the new investigation on its own evidence?
Well, the past pattern of behavior, you kind of put that out of your mind right now, because you have to really go on the mindset of, I have to prove this crime and this crime only, as if nothing else ever happened. And you can do that. And as an investigator, you can do that, because the previous behavior is going to come in. If it comes in at trial, it's going to come in through expert witnesses, through doctors, and through people who examine the people in question and things like that. So really, that doesn't really cloud, or shouldn't really cloud, your judgment. You just look at the case as it is. And I think they did that. I think in this case, they were suspicious of the mother's story from minute one, because they said that things just didn't add up. And so I don't think they said, oh, this guy, we had a 2018 case of child abuse, we are going to go after them. I think it started with the mother's story, which didn't make sense. It's a 7-month-old baby. What else could have happened? These are the people with custody of this child. They must be involved. And so I think you can hone in on that. And then later, when they're charged, now the prosecutor's working with people to maybe get a court-ordered psychiatric examination of these people, and then look at the past behavior. And then really that's not an investigator's role. That's kind of an expert witness role at trial, maybe, to kind of bring in some of that other stuff. But the investigation has to be solely focused on this particular crime, the evidence to prove this crime beyond a reasonable doubt, and not worry about the past behavior.
Yeah, I'm going to say, as we wrap up, it was just amazing that my audience is going to love you. I mean, your expertise is just unmatched. I truly enjoyed learning from everything that you had to provide. I mean, this actually makes me better as a provider, because I want to learn too in the process. That's the key.
Thank you.
And yeah, I just thought you were phenomenal. Is there anything you would like to say before we close out?
No, I mean, these are tough cases. They're tragic. They're horrific cases. And, I wish I didn't report on them and didn't have to report on them, but it's just kind of what I found myself doing these days, and in my retirement. And yeah, it's just these are the cases that I stay with you as investigators. I feel for the investigators that are going to investigate these cases. I remember every case and every child I ever recovered on the dive team, and I remember every child and every case we ever investigated as far as crimes against children. You remember their names. I remember their faces in many cases. I don't even watch a movie or a TV show if it's going to contain, violence against children or anything like that. I just won't sleep at night if I see something like that. And so these are difficult cases, and I understand people's emotional investment in them, and that they should have that emotional investment, because if we can't get ourselves motivated to protect the most vulnerable people in our communities, which are these children. And the younger, the more vulnerable, obviously. And if we can't get motivated to really be angry about these things, then God, where's our humanity? So I think that the audience has every right to feel, very, very strongly about these cases.
I'll tell you something, Bob, in the dark, man, you are like the beacon of light. I mean, you go into these worlds that most people don't even believe exists, and here you are sharing your experience. There is no greater gift to the world that you can give than what you are giving right now. So again, I thank you for what you did, and I'm hoping to have Bob on again. Bob understands that sometimes there's a last minute change, and I may have to just text him, but I would love to have you as a continued resource for the channel. I'm honored, and as always, guys, shows Tear Talk. Stay safe.